Hello, Stats class. Here's the lesson 11-2C notes. It is about the third type of chi-square test. So you may or may not have known this, but there are three types of chi-square tests. You probably had a clue when you looked at that chart where we did the first column only, right? And so when we started this chapter with 11-1, we did type 1, which was the goodness of fit test. Today we're going to learn the third one. So goodness of fit happens when we have one population and one sample from that population. We have one categorical variable. And the only way that this is different from chapters 8 and 9 is we allowed it to have many categories instead of only one category. And we compared those many categories from our sample, from our population. We compared it to the hypothetical proportions that we think were true. So that's where we started this chapter back before spring break. And then we moved on to lesson 11-2. In parts A and B of 11-2, we were talking about the second type, which was homogeneity tests. And that's where we have two or more populations and a sample from each, so two or more samples. We still only had one categorical variable, which was kind of a clue about where we're going next. It still had many categories. So like when we switched from chapters 8 and 9 to chapter 10, we switched from one population to two populations, and comparing, instead of comparing to some hypothetical proportion distribution, we were comparing the populations to each other. And that's a little bit different, although I think it's more interesting. And we were trying to see if they were homogeneous. That's what the name means. Homogeneous means they have the same proportions. Same proportions of those categories for each population. So the third type is today. Woohoo! 11-2C, which is, yes, this one that we're doing right now, is called the test of independence, or sometimes it's called a test of association. And we'll talk about the relationship there. Actually, we've already talked about this relationship because remember I told you the opposite of independent is not dependent because we don't want to imply cause and effect. The opposite of independent is associated. There's some kind of relationship there. And so what we do with independence is we go back to only one population and one sample. But now we allow ourselves to have two categorical variables, and we're comparing the variables instead of the populations. And those two categorical variables can have many categories in each. That's not a problem. And our goal is to compare the variables and see how they are related to each other. And there's two things that might happen. They might be independent variables, which means that they are the same proportions in each. Or they might be associated, which means the proportions are different. There's some kind of relationship. And what's interesting about this, well, one of the things that's interesting about this is that this is actually an awful lot like homogeneity. The data will be given in a two-way table for both of these. So for both homogeneity and independence, the data is in a two-way table, which means it's kind of sometimes hard to tell which one you're supposed to do. So the key is how to tell which one of these. It's based on how the data was gathered. If you are talking about an experiment with randomly assigned treatments, then those treatment groups are considered separate populations, and so that would be a homogeneity test. Population of people who had this, who could have had this treatment or something like that. So that's, if it's an experiment, that's what you do. If it's a sample, then it depends on whether you have a single sample or separate samples. So that's kind of almost too obvious, but I'm going to tell you, if it's an SRS and then you ask two questions, or you gather two measurements, if it's not people, right? If you ask two questions, that would be independence. But if you separate your population first and take separate random samples from the different groups of your population, that would be a stratified sample. Separate samples means you're doing homogeneity. So you would always get some kind of, if you're doing it for yourself, you know which way you did it, of course. If you're not doing it for yourself, you look for clues in the wording of the problem. So did they gather their data and then separate into male and female, or did they take a sample of males and a separate sample of females? That's how you tell the difference between these. That's just an example. The good news is, once you've decided which is which, almost everything else is the same for both types. Homogeneity and independence are almost the same test, so the calculations are the same, and the conditions are the same. For homogeneity and for independence. So that's kind of nice. It means you already know how to do it, except guess what isn't the same? The other two steps. So that's what I'm going to talk about. And I'm not even going to do the whole 4-step test right now. I'm just going to tell you how they're different because that's all you really need to know. And then in the review notes, I can maybe do an example. We'll see. So the hypotheses are worded a little bit differently. So the hypotheses, let's go back up here for just a minute. We're seeing if they're independent or associated. If we were in class, I would ask you, which of these do you think is the null? Which is the dull situation where everything's just not interesting? It would be the independence thing. Independent is the null hypothesis and associated is the alternate, and that's what we're going to put down here. So the null, you could either say they're independent or you could say there's no association. I'm going to say it both ways because both ways are right. So you could say the variables, but it's always about your variables instead of about your populations, and that's weird. The variables blank and blank are independent. So independent would be your null, Or you could write it as there is no association. I actually kind of prefer the second one. There is no association. It's kind of the same as saying there's no difference between two things. These are your variables. So you always name the variables, and that's how you do the context of your null hypothesis. Notice the population is not quite so important, but you could also name the population. You could say there's no association between blank and blank for the population of, yeah, whatever. That's not as important as the variables this time. And the alternate is, obviously, there is an association. So if you want them to look like total opposites, that's what you write. You write there's no association, and then there is an association. Between my two variables. Do not use the word dependent. So I'm going to write it and then I'm going to cross it off. Don't use that word. And the reason is we don't use dependent as the opposite of independent. We've been talking about this since the beginning because it implies cause and effect. And we don't know if it's cause and effect unless we did an experiment. I suppose if you did an experiment, it'd be okay to say that, but I think it's better to just never use that word. And so that would be only for experiments. If you must use it, use it on experiments only. So there is an association, works for experiments just as well. I think you should get in the habit of just writing there is an association. So I'm going to do a partial example, not the full 4 steps, but just to give you an idea of how these hypotheses would be worded. And then the conclusion would be worded based on these hypotheses, of course. So here's an example, but I'm not going to do the whole thing. We are looking at hair color versus eye color. And so these are my two variables. My hair color and my eye color are my two variables. And we have this two-way table where we classify people by whether they have black hair or brown hair or blonde hair, red hair. We're not going to go with all the blues and purples and things you can dye it as, but natural hair colors. And then eye colors could be brown or blue or green, or I guess we could add hazel or something. I'm not going to go there. I'm just going to stick with 3 categories of eye colors. And as you probably could guess, people are more likely to have brown eyes if they have black or brown hair, and if they have blue eyes, they're more likely to have blonde hair. And there's definitely going to be some kind of an association here. But what you do is you don't separate, we're not separating our population into different hair colors and then randomly sampling some black-haired people and some brown-haired people. It'd be so much easier to just take a sample from our population, one single group, and we're going to record the 2 variables for everybody in that group. So we're going to record their hair color and their eye color, and then fill in our table with that. And because we are asking 2 questions from our one sample, that makes it an independence test. I suppose if we wanted to be crazy, we could classify them by hair color and then randomly sample them. I think it's easier to just take a random sample and ask them both questions. So there we go. Our null hypothesis is that hair color and eye color have some kind of, or have no relationship. That means they're independent. Or you could write there is no association. What that means is that if someone has black hair, they're equally likely to have brown or blue or green eyes. Probably not true. And so we're probably going to reject. And then the alternate is that hair color and eye color are associated. And let me finish writing this first. And really, that's all you have to say. Notice it's not that at least one proportion is different, although that's what this means. It means at least one proportion is different, but associated means that there's a difference between the blonde-haired distribution of eye color and the black-haired distribution of eye color. That blonde-haired people are more likely to have blue or green eyes and not brown than the black-haired people. So that's what we're saying, is we're saying that there's a relationship. If we reject, which we probably would, we would still have the same type of conclusion. So we would still say since P and all of that good stuff, and we would reject most likely with this data. I don't have data right now, but that's okay. It's probably in your homework. So reject, what is it we're rejecting? We're rejecting the null that hair color and eye color are independent. And we can conclude that they're associated. So it's actually pretty simple when you think about it. You just have to remember which word is which word goes with the null and which one goes with the alternate. And then the follow-up analysis is where you would look at the components and see which ones are more likely to happen. Which, if the observed is greater than the expected versus if the observed is less than the expected, and you would comment on that. The ones that are most different from what was expected. So that's the follow-up thing that we have done before, and we will talk about that some more in the next set of notes. And that's it for today, or for the first half of today's lesson. Second half will be a review, and I will make a separate video for that.